Hi there. Today we're going to be learning how to create this Rubik's Cube scramble and unscramble animation loop in Blender. I'll be using Blender 4.1, rendering using the Eevee engine, but anything should really work. This is a relatively beginner-friendly tutorial. I won't be going over all the basics, but if you're fairly new to Blender, I think this should still be relatively easy to follow. Or at least I hope so. Alright, so we're going to start up Blender here, get rid of everything as is tradition, add in the basic cube, and add a bevel modifier to it. I actually put in 5 segments here, but I changed that down to, I think, 2 or 3 later on in the process to save on animation time. So we're going to mark it smooth by angle to give us that kind of polished, rounded plastic that we're looking for. And then also go into edit mode, go into line mode, and clear sharp. That'll help round off some of those transitions between the bevel and the flat face. Next, we're going to move it up, and then duplicate it, and move it over, and then duplicate it again, and move it to the side like this. Something I do want to note is that there is something in the Rubik's Cube's construction that you may not realize. Even if you go up to whatever higher dimension of Rubik's Cube you want, 5x5, 10x10, anything, it's all composed out of only 3 pieces. At least the cube ones are. There's center pieces, edge pieces, and corner pieces. And everything else is actually composed out of those exclusively. Now you may also note that each of these pieces has a different beveling style. The center piece has beveling heavier around all 4 of its edges, the corner piece has it only around a couple, and the edge piece has it around 3. So we do that with a manual bevel in the edit mode because we can actually specify which edges we want that to happen on. Next, we're going to create the face stickers by simply duplicating a face from the center piece, moving it down, scaling it in a little bit, and extruding it. And something I want to note here is that you actually can't have this too thin because it's still one object, so it'll mess with the bevel modifier. And just to make things easier, we are going to keep each of these pieces as singular objects rather than doing like a parenting situation or something like that. Next, we're going to duplicate the stickers and then move them onto the sides, and then duplicate one once more and move it onto the other side of the corner piece. Now, in order for the rotations to happen as we want them to, we want to make sure that the origin is always at the center, which should still be where the 3D cursor is. So that's what I've just done here. Next, we're going to actually join those pieces together using Ctrl-J to create singular objects. And these 3 pieces are all we need to create our Rubik's Cube. Next, we're going to duplicate these 2, rotate it by 90 degrees, do that twice to create the top face, duplicate this whole thing to create the bottom face, grab these pieces in the middle, rotate them around again, and then we just need 2 more face pieces. And that's actually all there is to modeling a Rubik's Cube. We are now complete with the modeling process. Next, I'm just going to set up camera, lights, and some basic materials so we can start to visualize our cube coming together. Okay, now it's time to start creating the materials. Since it is made out of a polished plastic, I didn't really feel the need to get too deep into texturing or anything, but you can obviously do that if you'd like a more photorealistic result. So I'm just going to go through and create a black material and then 6 color materials for each of the different faces. And by the way, if you don't know, there's actually pretty specific guidelines on how exactly a Rubik's Cube is supposed to be colored. The top face is always white, and the opposite of that is yellow. One of the faces is red, the opposite of that is orange. One of them is blue, the opposite of that is green. And then there's also guidelines on how it's supposed to be, those pairs are in relation to each other. So make sure you just pull up a reference image of a Rubik's Cube if you're not super familiar with that. Also, a little trick for selecting the faces that we're going to color using this method is if you hit Shift-G, you can select by attribute, and we're going to select coplanar to get all of the other stickers on that face. And then just to extend the selection down a little more, you do select more or control numpad plus. I do not have a numpad on my keyboard though, so I was not able to do that. And then we just do the same procedure on all 6 sides. And also, if you're wondering how I'm editing all of these objects at once, you just have to select all of them in object mode, and then when you hit tab, you'll be entering edit mode on all of the objects simultaneously. Also, make sure that you copy the materials that we've laid out to every single object in the scene, otherwise this procedure will not work. There are obviously different ways of doing this, but I found this to be the most convenient way to quickly model the Rubik's Cube. So here I'm just doing the same thing, coloring each of these faces. Alright, and now our Rubik's Cube is actually fully modeled and shaded. And we're going to get started on the animation. First, I'm just going to change some settings, 60 frames a second, specify my output directory, and then also change it to AVI JPEG. Then finally, I thought the black plastic didn't look quite shiny enough, so I'm tweaking some settings here to give it a little bit of a more polished appearance, because that kind of polished plastic is a little bit different than the more papery stickers of the colors, so I wanted to give a little bit of distinction there. I'm not really going for photorealism in this one, but maybe that's just me coping at not being too good at texturing. I don't know. Now, one very important thing to note here is that you actually want to set the rotation mode on all of the objects, or all of the segments of the cube, to quaternion, not Euler XYZ. And we'll see why later, but this has to do with how Blender handles rotations. So select quaternion and then right click on that and copy to selected with everything selected. And also, something that I believe is new to Blender 4.1 is that when you press I to insert a keyframe, instead of pulling up the context menu like it did before, it just automatically does location, rotation, scale, which is definitely a lot more convenient than it used to be. So creating the animation is pretty simple. You just grab all 9 pieces on a side, rotate them by 90, -90, or 180 degrees, and then insert keyframes for every object on that frame. I'm going to start off with every 40 frames, but you can obviously edit that if you want a faster or slower animation. Also, I recommend pulling up a Rubik's Cube scramble algorithm to help you actually create a real random solve. So there we go, there's our first motion. And past this point, it's essentially just doing the same thing like 20 times in a row, so I'm probably going to fast forward through this a little bit. Okay, I'm pretty happy with how that's looking, so let's take a look back at the animation and... that's a bit odd, isn't it? Some of those corner and edge pieces are behaving very strangely. Well, this is because of the way that Blender interpolates between keyframes, and the default setting is Bezier curves, which kind of blend into each other a little bit. I'm not super familiar on how exactly this works, but what you can do to fix this is just change it to any other interpolation type, like I like to do quadratic, and then make sure you do ease in and out, and then that fixes our issue. Alright, looking good. As you can see, everything stays nicely in alignment, and we don't get that kind of strange overshoot, like twisting effect that we did before. Alright, so now that we have the scramble animation, it's time to unscramble it. Now, you actually could go through and redo a different scramble that'll produce the same result if you want to, but to be honest, I didn't really feel like doing that. So what you can do is just take the keyframes, duplicate them, and then scale along the x-axis by -1, and you will do the opposite thing that the previous animation was. So in this case, we've got our scramble and then our solve. Now when you're looking at it head on from a static camera angle, it does become fairly obvious that that's what's going on, but we will have a panning camera around like you saw in the beginning that kind of helps hide that a little bit. So I like having the scramble be a little faster than the solve, to just kind of convey the idea that the scramble is like random motion, it doesn't take as much thought or effort, and then the solve is something you're thinking about a little more, so it should naturally take a little bit longer. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. Next, I'm just going to go back into the graph editor and tweak things a little bit. Going to try a couple different interpolation modes. Another thing you can do that is quite good is the back interpolation, which gives it a little bit of snap, kind of a little bit more like how you would actually move a Rubik's Cube. I also like the ease out only back interpolation, where it kind of snaps into motion and then slowly finds its spot. And I think I actually go with this one. Yeah, looking pretty good. Okay, now we hit Alt-H to bring everything back into view, and now it is time to animate the camera. We're going to put an empty down at the world origin, and then parent the camera to the empty to give it a circular tracking motion around the center of our world. Alright, and now for the empty, you actually do want it to be on XYZ Euler, not Quaternion, because of the way interpolation works. Because with XYZ Euler, you can do a 360 rotation, and it will actually not... with a Quaternion, it'll just stay in place, but with the XYZ Euler, it'll actually do what you're looking for. So I want this to be an entirely uninterrupted animation, so I'm just going to go with linear interpolation, so that you can't tell at all that the animation is looping. However, this kind of motion is rather boring. It's very mechanical, very static, so there is something we can do to make it a little bit more interesting. So here I'm just tweaking the camera a little bit. And the next thing we're going to do is add a little bit of random motion to the camera. So if you go into the side tab and go to the modifiers, you can add a noise function to the location. Now in the default settings, it's very jittery and not really what we're looking for. So bring the scale way up, and you get this kind of smooth, randomized, kind of a sinusoidal motion. And that's a lot more like what I'm looking for. Now, you go down to this thing called Restrict Frame Range, and you set the start and end to the start and end of your animation, and then I did about 200 frames of blend in and out. So this way, we still get that random motion, but the camera ends up in exactly the same spot that it did at the start of the animation, and that's very important for maintaining that perfect loop. So what we can do, we can copy that modifier, remove it, and then just add it onto the Y and Z location variables, I guess they're called, and then also move the phase on each of those just to a random spot, because it can be a little odd if the X, Y, and Z motion is all synced up together. So this helps create a little bit more of like a handheld, kind of natural, like somebody walking around this object. Obviously it's not totally convincing of that, but it's a pretty quick and easy way to set that up. So now taking a look at our animation, I'm pretty happy with how that looks. Alright, and I think that's going to about do it for this tutorial. I'm going to add a few more things in off camera. I'll do a little bit of background work, change the lighting a little bit, and then we're going to take a look at the final animation one more time. Alright, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you found that interesting, and I know there are a lot of other Rubik's Cube tutorials out there, but something I don't think there's a tutorial for is how to make a Mega Minx Rubik's Cube. So I'm currently working on that, and I should have that up in just a few days. Thank you for watching. Bye.